Port Arthur. Finally, after about 3 months of living in a country I didn't like, we arrived in Port Arthur, Ontario. Our 81-year-old great-uncle Walter drove us 2 boys all the way from Wisconsin. And it wasn't Uncle Walter's first time in Canada. When he and my grandmother were children, their father, my great-grandfather, was posted to Citadel Hill in Halifax, Nova Scotia. He was a sergeant major in the British Signal Corps and was there to teach Morse code. I visited Citadel Hill when I was in the army. The coffee house used to be the classroom where my grandmother and Uncle Walter attended school. For the 4 years they lived in the Dominion of Canada. When we arrived at our new home, there were 2 beds waiting for us in the unfinished, musty basement. On my first sleep in my bed, I discovered odd-looking beetles crawling on my blankets in the morning. I didn't like sleeping with insects and mentioned it to my parents. They said I would soon get used to them. My brother didn't seem to mind the beetle-like insects, so I just had to accept them in my bed. In England, we had a cabinet radio. It was a major piece of furniture, but now we had a small radio on a shelf, and that was new to me. My father would turn our radio on while we ate breakfast, because at that hour, march music was blasting out of its little speaker. I liked the march music. It got our blood pumping in the mornings. Our dad would hum along between bites. He must have been familiar with those tunes when served in the British Army. Even though we were British subjects in a British colony, the Dominion of Canada, my dad had to jump through the same hoops as any other immigrant. The unemployment office found my dad a job that Canadian citizens were not too keen on doing. My dad's job was to shovel a hill of clay in the yard of the Abitibi paper mill. I have recently discovered why paper mills need clay. It's actually called China clay, and it improves the appearance of paper and also is used as a paper filler. My dad was part of a small team of immigrant men that shoveled by hand on rotating shifts, and by the time my brother and I arrived in Canada, Dad had been shoveling for 4 months and looked very trim and muscular. It was August, and I was 13 years old when my brother and I arrived in Port Arthur, so school was out. I would sometimes spend time in the backyard of the old house looking for things to do. I tried my hand at art, painting, what I saw across the lane, because now I was in a city that had city blocks. London doesn't have them. At the end of our yard, there was a back lane, and on the other side of the lane was another backyard. It was there, across the lane, where I met my first Canadian acquaintance. His name was Leslie, and his last name sounded unusual to me, so I asked him. He said he was Polish. I thought, if he's Polish, where are all the Canadians? I liked Leslie, and one day he invited me into his house. It was like going to another country. His brother's name was Marian, and his parents were speaking in Polish. Leslie told me that they can't speak English. That was a shock. I had no idea that Canada was a place of immigrants, and as I later discovered, the whole city was full of first or second generation immigrants, so I could learn about many foreign countries without even leaving town. School. My secondary school in England was called St. Barnabas. And here I was in another school with a religious-sounding name. St. Barnabas School actually had no connection to religion. At least not when I did my first term there at 12 years old. My teacher was a fighter pilot in the war, where he had been wounded and had a lung removed. So every Wednesday he would go for oxygen treatments. I really liked my teacher. He was a war hero who helped to save England from the Luftwaffe during the Battle of Britain. My fighter pilot teacher told my mother that I was an excellent student, so she had high hopes for me in Canadian schools. But I was successful in English schools because the teachers were rigorous. I saw the consequences of disturbing the class in primary school. My teacher would casually and with crepe sole shoes on silently walk to the back of the class as we were doing our assignments. Then walk back in the aisle where the culprit was working and, with an open hand, whack him around the ear. There's nothing like a good whack around the ear hole to get one's mind back on his work. I never saw a girl get a whack, but girls are more intelligent than boys. So, in fear of getting a whack around the side of the head, the class was always completely silent, which was perfect for me. As I needed to focus to do my assignments, autistic people don't study. They need to fixate to remember. But now I was in St. James School in Port Arthur, where corporal punishment was not delivered instantly, as I was soon to find out. First, I was placed in grade 8 as they were not familiar with the British school system. But I was way ahead in some subjects and behind in others, so they put me into grade 7. At St. James School, I learned that Louis St. Laurent was our Prime Minister, that the Trans-Canada Highway was still in the early stages of construction, and that we were still being taught English history. I hated English history because it seemed never-ending, with so many significant dates to remember. But fortunately, English history ended in grade 7. Canadian history began with the French settlers known as Acadians, who lived in the French colony of Acadia. Acadians were farmers in the maritime provinces before the English arrived, took their farms away, and deported them to the Caribbean islands and Louisiana, which was still a French colony. When I learned that fact in history class, I didn't feel so proud to say I was English. Now, near the end of my life, I live among the descendants of the Acadians who managed to hide from the British and stay in Canada. I am happy they are here in New Brunswick because it was mostly Acadians who took care of my medical needs, including curing my prostate cancer. My grade 7 teacher was an expatriate Englishman and apparently quite homesick until he noticed my London accent and found it was just what he'd been missing. So he had me read in front of the class quite often. My teacher would have me read Charles Dickens books, and I laid my English accent on thick because I liked to entertain, and later in life made a lot of extra money doing just that. One day, the teacher wrote a bunch of single numbers vertically on the blackboard and had students add them up quickly. He called it speed adding. When it was my turn, I couldn't do it, not fast. With the class watching, it was too much pressure. I couldn't get past the third number, and I couldn't use autism as an excuse, because I didn't know I had it, and slight autism was not even known back then. Bendy Cane. On Wednesday afternoon, Canon Turner showed up as he always did. I didn't know what a canon was. I thought it was his first name, but I have recently learned that a canon is a retired priest. Bibles were passed around, but not enough. So we had to share with someone who had a Bible at their desk. I was told to sit with this kid, who seemed to look older than the rest of us. And as Canon Turner was preaching, this kid was quietly making remarks that I found humorous, so I would snicker quietly. Our teacher was watching us, but didn't say anything until Canon Turner had left. Then we were both sent to the principal's office. The principal was a tall, skinny German man with a 3-foot-long bamboo cane. Now, bamboo is usually quite hard to bend, but as that stick came down on my right hand, I could see the stick bending before it hit. And after another one of the strikes, I stopped watching the stick bend because I was in a world of hurt. After 5 lightning strikes on my right hand, the principal stopped, and I figured it was over, and the kid that deserved it would now get his. But no. The principal told me to hold out my left hand and commenced to apply 5 more whacks with that bendy bamboo cane, while I was thinking it was a bit much just because I had a good sense of humour. But I didn't care, because the joker that got me here was now going to get his. The class clown held out his right hand, while I stood there to watch his face when he got what he deserved. After 5 whacks on the kid's right hand, he was told to hold out his left hand, It was then that both the principal and I were amazed to see that the kid had a finger missing. I looked at the kid, then at the principal waiting. Then the principal said, "Hold out his right hand." And the class clown got 5 more hard whacks on his one good hand. I made it back into the class, holding back tears of laughter. Class clowns were my education's demise. There was at least one in every class, and quite often a whole class would laugh. Meanwhile, my report cards were getting worse, because fixation requires complete silence. Some of the kids would tease me about my accent. They were second-generation immigrant kids, and all had the same Canadian accent. I took their teasing in stride and tried to copy the way they spoke, hoping I would eventually talk like them. It only took me a few years before nobody could tell I was English. At least they didn't keep asking me where I was from anymore. I just kept trying to talk with a Canadian accent until I spoke it fluently, without trying. But there was this one boy who kept making fun of the way I spoke, and I confronted him in the playground. I said, "Why do you keep making fun of the way I talk?" He said, "I know making fun of you accent, I got no teeth." I took a closer look at the boy and was surprised to see that Victor didn't have a tooth in his head. Canadian experiences. One winter evening, when the sun went down earlier than my curfew, I walked by a strange man in a fedora hat and overshoes. He asked me what position I played. I had no clue what he was asking me, and he was getting impatient. "Offense or defense?" he asked. I still had no idea. Still, I wanted him gone, so I said, "Defense." Then the fedora-clad man said, "Be at the rink Saturday morning," and continued walking down the sidewalk. On the way home, I thought about what the man had said and figured it must be the game Canadians play called ice hockey. I had never had ice skates on or a hockey stick in my hand, so that was a no-show. I heard country music on the radio for the first time. Jimmy Rogers, the singing brakeman, was singing the song called T for Texas. I learned the lyrics to that song, and one day I sang it to my English parents with as much Texas drawl as I could muster. T for Texas. T for Tennessee. T for Tailma. That gal sheer made a wreck out of me. I sang while playing chords on my 12-bass accordion, with my parents laughing their heads off. To us, country music was a joke, but later in life I made a lot of extra money singing and playing it. I say extra money because I never quit my day job, and I received that good advice from someone who heard me singing. My parents were coming up in the world. My mother always worked in England. She was a bookkeeper at a butcher shop and later found a position at the Port Arthur Public Library. My father got a job with the Port Arthur Police Force, and this time he was in a squad car, which was a good thing, because you don't want to be patrolling on a motorbike at 35 below zero, something else my father didn't see on that map. My dad took to the Canadian bush like a native. It was called bush, because it wasn't a forest where you could easily walk between the trees, like in England and Europe. It had a nasty undergrowth, making it necessary to look for animal trails to get anywhere while swatting clouds of flies. It wasn't long before my father announced that he was president of the Fish and Game Association, and later he became a Mason. My dad got me to tag along on his fishing trips, and this one time we were fishing at Wolf Lake. I asked him what he brought for lunch. He said, "A loaf of bread. If we catch a fish, we'll have a fish sandwich." My dad did catch a pickerel. We lit a fire, hung the fillets over it, then placed a fillet between 2 slices of plain bread, and that was lunch. But he did have a thermos of tea. No respectable Englishman would ever go without his cup of tea, and that was my dad's idea of a good time. Tupper Street. We moved to a better rented house near the top of a steep hill called Tupper Street. I was 14 when I made up this little ditty. Come to supper at Upper Tupper. My father had shot his first moose, and we were enjoying a roast of moose for the first time. I noticed a nasty big hair in my meat and pointed it out. I mean, who likes hair in their food? My dad said, "Just take that out, it won't hurt you." This was Dad's first time butchering a moose, so I figured that my hair was a one-time thing. Meat was expensive in England. We would eat it only once or twice a week. But now my dad had all the meat he could eat, and he was a very good hunter, which made sense, I thought. After all, our last name is Hunt. But eating too much red meat can kill you, and my dad died from a heart attack in 1981 while he was getting out of his boat with a string of fish. We were eating supper at Upper Tupper Street House, and Dad was angry about something. But as we looked at him, the plaster ceiling directly above him collapsed onto his head. Dad wasn't injured, but we had a tough time holding back laughter. Girls. There was a beautiful girl about my age living right next door on Tupper Street. The girl next door was too good looking for me, I thought. But one day she asked me if I would escort her to the movies to see Love Me Tender, and I was elated. The next day, another girl, who was not beautiful at all and a bit frumpy, also asked me to escort her to the movies on Saturday. I didn't have the heart to say no, so I also agreed. Saturday came, and both girls were waiting outside my door. There didn't seem to be a problem. Maybe they knew each other, so with a girl on each arm, off we went. I didn't realize that escort was a platonic term. I thought these girls actually liked me, but their parents probably told them they had to have an escort if they wanted to go to the movies. It was like that back in the 50s, but I didn't know that. Once in the theater, we sat with one girl on each side of me, and while Elvis was singing Love Me Tender, I wanted to put my arm around the beautiful girl, but I didn't want to hurt the other girl's feelings, so I put my arm around both of them. Because girls kept their thoughts to themselves in the 1950s, I didn't trust them. I'd go out with them, but I was always on guard. I would see young females whispering to each other and wondered what the hell they were talking about. They might have been talking about how much they wanted to screw me. I didn't know they had sexual fantasies. If I did, I would have been happy to oblige. My brother knew about girls, but he kept it secret, the selfish bastard.